All right, good. So, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, for our meeting, the topic is the use of self-direction for a shared living arrangement. So, over the years, I've talked about this in different forums. I thought it would be good for us to have a more in-depth conversation about the options that are available. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is about live-in caregiver option within self-direction. Okay, so let me just share my screen. All right. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so I wanted to just start with, sometimes I think sharing a personal story is a good way for people to understand and grasp what this might look like. So Oscar is somebody many of you might have met or heard speak before. He's been living in his own apartment for 3 years. Actually, it's been 5 years. This is an older PowerPoint. And he likes being independent, and he has a very interesting life. So he lives in a 3-bedroom apartment near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. He lives with a man named Lewis and another man named Matt, or actually it's Damien. And Lewis has been a teacher for people with autism, and Damien was actually a co-worker of Oscar's at his job at Shake Shack. That's how he met him. They each, all 3 have their own room, and they take turns, both Damien and Lewis take turns supporting Oscar, and there's 2 bedrooms, so it's a really nice, spacious apartment. He moved in August of 2015 when he was in his last year of high school, and he's only slept in his family apartment for 3 times. It was a big concern. We were not sure how the transition was going to go, but it's went very well. He does have Friday night family night where he sees his parents and his younger brother Hugo, and he usually sees his folks a few other times throughout the week, and he does keep in close communication with them. And together with his roommates, they go food shopping, they take walks in the neighborhood, and they do laundry. So this was Oscar's story. We have a few at CFS, a few arrangements that have a live-in caregiver, and that we've learned some lessons, which I will share with you. Okay, so this is just some ways on how we got to making the decision for Oscar to utilize live-in caregiver. So again, we brought together the circle of support. So broker and MSC at the time, or care manager, and Oscar's parents. He has a few different people in his life that have stayed in contact from the school system. So a teacher that has now become a friend. And we did some detailed person-centered planning. We've utilized some tools to really get a sense of what his day looks like. And we took a look at what the different housing options are. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is in the service system, in my opinion, in New York has an array of options, which I like, because as you know, your own kids, there's no one solution fits all approach. It really has to be person centered. So, there's some families that I speak to that say, I never want my child to live in a group home. And there's some people that say my child would do really well in a group home. And so that's really a decision that has to be made by you and your family. And so it's a very personalized choice. So I'm just today talking about the choice as it relates to live-in caregiver and self-direction. So we did for Oscar, we looked at the array of options that were available, including residential living and group home living. And what we felt was that he would not do as well in a group home. For Oscar in particular, being around other individuals with different disabilities ended up creating more high levels of anxiety for him, and he just didn't seem to. He really didn't have any many friends in that respect. and he liked to do his own thing. So he's a very individualized schedule, and so being in a group home would we felt would kind of restrain him and his life. So we ruled that out as an option and started to think about living with a peer roommate. So somebody else, maybe a friend. And as I mentioned, he really didn't have a whole lot of friends. And one of the lessons that I've learned, and I've probably spoken to some of you about this, is that also can get a little complicated. So if you get an apartment with another person who's a friend, then you have to take into consideration that person's needs and wants, the family. You have to make shared business decisions because you're living together. You're potentially sharing staffing and expenses. So we took a look at that as an option and felt like that wasn't the most suitable option for Oscar. Like I said, that could be something that would be of interest to you, but in Oscar's case, that wasn't. And then we started talking about, well, what were some of the options available? And in Oscar's case, his parents had an apartment that they bought as a rental property. So his mother's in real estate. She had purchased this apartment and was renting it out to tenants, and that was a source of revenue for them. So we talked about maybe if we could utilize that apartment for Oscar, and if he had a live-in caregiver roommate, that would be good. So once we kind of looked at all the different options and we honed in on Oscar having his own apartment with roommates that were companions and that could provide that level of support to him, we moved forward with developing a self-directed plan. And we started to establish the steps that would be needed for transition. So one of the things that his parents decided to do, and in this case, because it was owned by the parents, what they decided to do was put the apartment in trust. So in trust for Oscar. So now a trust owned the apartment, and we could then pay, we could pay the rent to the trust. We developed the self-directed budget, and we included a portion in housing subsidy, so that a portion of Oscar's share of his rental expense could be covered through a housing subsidy. And we took a look at the apartment because it was a 3-bedroom apartment, and we said this gives us a good opportunity to have 2 live-in caregivers. So typical arrangement would be 1, but because it's a 3-bedroom apartment, we talked about having 2. Each person could have their own room, and it would give them some flexibility too. If somebody needed to go visit family and take a week off, somebody else would be able to be there, or if a live-in wanted to spend the night out or go away for a weekend, it would give that flexibility. We looked at community habilitation. We chose agency-supported ComHab so that we as an agency could help him with the staffing. We included brokerage, some transportation, and some cell phones. So the bulk of the expense in his budget is really the housing cost. So when I have here 2 live-in caregivers, basically what the budget is paying for is the share of the live-in roommate's rent and food and utility expense. So if you, let's say, have an apartment that, let's say you have 1 live-in caregiver, just for the math to be clean. If it's $1,200, that would mean that the share of the individual, like Oscar, would be $600, and the share of the roommate would be $600. So the budget is going to pay housing subsidy towards Oscar's share of the rent, and then a live-in caregiver rental subsidy towards the other $600. So this way we're paying for that person's share of the rent, and a portion of food and utilities as well. Okay, so that's basically what the plan. There was a lot, obviously, that went into this, and everybody's circumstance is different. I'm just giving this as an example. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So in self-direction, a live-in caregiver is defined as a care provider who resides in the same household as the individual, and they are providing support, as needed supports in the areas of physical, social, or emotional needs for the person to be able to live safely in his or her own home. They can't be related by blood or marriage, and they cannot be somebody who has control or authority regarding the individual's resources, so like a guardian or anything like that. Okay, so as I mentioned, a portion of the additional costs incurred for that live-in, in order for that live-in to be a roommate, the budget will pay a portion of the room and board. That would include rent, utilities, and food. Another requirement is that the individual reside in his or her own home or leased residence. So it couldn't be the case where it's the live-in caregiver's home and we're paying a share of their expense. This would be the home is owned or rented by the individual that we're supporting, the individual with the disability, and then the live-in caregiver is going to be utilizing that home to reside in exchange for the live-in caregiver service. Okay, now there's a lot of applicable labor laws related to caregiver living in an individual's home. So some of you might think of live-in, you might have heard of live-in when it comes to senior citizens, where they might have a live-in home attendant, or a nanny, an au pair, where they're living in the individual's home and they're providing some service. So there's very specific labor laws in the way that you construct a plan like this. Has to be, you have to understand what those are. So we're not paying the live-in caregiver as an hourly employee. We're in essence paying for their share of room and board, the utilities and the food, in exchange for this companionship role. So they're not going to be doing specific tasks. They're not going to be doing tasks where assisting with daily living skills or things like a ComHab staff would be doing. That's outside of the role of a live-in caregiver. Their role is strictly to provide fellowship and protection. So that could mean like a typical roommate situation. That could be like a typical roommate situation where they're, reading together, doing a craft or a game, or they're doing errands for the apartment. So those kinds of things. And then protection would mean if something happens, like a lot of people will think about this option for overnight. So when people are sleeping, you might be worried that if your son or daughter is asleep, if there's an emergency that happens, who's going to help them? So that would be the role of the live-in, to respond in the event of an emergency. Okay, so Joe, the lease is in the individual's name, correct? Yes, and I'm going to get to the reason for that as well. So again, the role, it's a companionship arrangement, and it's a provision of fellowship and protection. So you have to think about the this is a typical roommate scenario with the added protection and fellowship that goes along with that. And in exchange for that, they get to live free room and board. And we're going to further define what that means. Now, I mentioned that the live-in caregiver is not doing community habilitation and is not doing home health aid or PCA. They're not paid as a live-in to do those tasks. But you might hire them also in addition to do those tasks. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so OPWDD requires that when you're utilizing a live-in caregiver, in order for CFS as the FI to bill for this, there needs to be 2 agreements in place. One of the agreements is between us, the FI, and you, the individual, and their family. The other agreement is between you, the individual, and the family, and the live-in caregiver. So the FI does not have an agreement between the FI and the live-in caregiver. That I want to just point that out because there are risks involved, which I'm going to talk about, and you have to be very clear that you understand what those risks are and that you're comfortable with that. Excuse me. So there is no employment relationship as the FI. We are not employing this person as a live-in caregiver. You are. You're the individual that's being supported and or their family are. So the agreement between you and this live-in should be, is required. OPWDD gives a template of those categories that need to be covered in the agreement, but they allow you the flexibility to personalize it and add information that you want to add. So, this is an example of Oscar's agreement. And my suggestion is that you spell out exactly what's included and required, and make sure that it's personalized to what your needs are, and take a lot of time to craft this. If you are moving into this arena, you might want to consult with a friend who's an attorney, or pay an attorney to review the agreement, because if you think about this, you're having a person who's going to be living in a home with your son or daughter. So there are a lot of great things that can happen, but also if things don't go well, you want to make sure that you've spelled out very clearly what this arrangement looks like. Okay, so the first bullet is talking about room and board, as I mentioned. So you're spelling out that the room and board is being provided in exchange for the companionship service. We pay that rental and utility share. It doesn't go directly to the live-in. We're not allowed to give it directly to the live-in. So we will pay the rental share to the landlord, and the utility and food share would go to the individual or family designee. Okay? And this is a new addition. So as I mentioned, I've done this presentation over the years, and we've learned some lessons. So one of the lessons is to put very clearly in the agreement that the live-in caregiver is designated as a licensee and has no possessory interest in the property, and that the license provides the live-in caregiver with the right to occupy and use the space in direct connection with the companionship role as outlined above. So what that's saying is, you live-in caregiver are not a tenant. Okay, because if they're a tenant, they can fight that they need to be given eviction process and certain legal protections that are afforded to tenants. So it's important to spell out that they're not a tenant, but rather the nature of the relationship is one of a licensee. Okay, let me just see. I think I saw a question pop up. Hold on. Okay. Yes, and I'll get to that too, Denise, about that. So, okay, so that's again a lesson learned, because I haven't heard many scenarios where it hasn't gone well, but we have had recently a situation where the live-in caregiver is claiming tenancy rights and is not leaving so easily. Okay. So as I mentioned, funds, so we can't, this is another question that comes up from time to time. Funds cannot be given directly to the live-in caregiver from the FI. It has to go through the individual and their advocate. So what some families have done is they've purchased a food card, like a preloaded sort of debit card. So they would give us receipts for $200 through Evero, and then we would give them the $200 back, and that $200 would get loaded into this food card, and that makes it easier for the live-in caregiver and the individual to do their food purchasing. So, this can be something that you would personalize and figure out how to, what's the arrangement going to look like in your unique circumstance. So in Oscar's case, we added in things about utilizing good judgment when making purchases. I've seen in other agreements where they've talked about specifying very clearly that things like toilet paper and paper towel are shared. However, things that are personal to each resident has to be, so the live-in caregiver should be purchasing personal items like a special shampoo or toothpaste that they're using, right? So there's some things that are not going to be covered, and there are other things that are going to be shared between the roommates. So again, it's very important to craft an agreement. I can't stress that enough. You want to just think about worst case scenario here. Okay. And then you want to set expectations for the hours. So typically what I recommend is 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. Now, again, we're not paying them from the hours of 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. But the expectation is that they are in the apartment during those hours, in order to provide and be willing and able to be called to duty if there's an emergency. So this is really the whole crux of why you want to live in, is to replace the need for that overnight staff person in a group home sitting up, staring at the walls in case something happens, right? So everybody's sleeping, but if there's an emergency, that person needs to be able to provide that level of support. Okay, so Denise, to your point, so what we do, you know, and most of the live-in caregiver arrangements do have where the staff person is also hired as a habilitation, as a ComHab staff, a self-hired ComHab staff. The beauty of that, and in Oscar's case, they utilize it this way, is that you know, maybe it's hard to find somebody in the morning. Like in Oscar's case, he goes to work, travels on his own, but he needs somebody to just make sure he's getting his day started. So that person is living there. They could provide a half hour to an hour every morning to help him get his day started. And then at the end of the night to make sure that he's taken a shower, that he's had something to eat. So they're providing that hourly support, where the same kind of tasks that another staff would do, you would then hire them as a self-hired ComHab staff. And then in that case, all of the wage and hour rules would apply. So we put that in this agreement too, that if in fact you're hiring that person to also provide community hab, or it might even be home health aide or CDPAP, you know, you want to just indicate that that role is separate from their role as a live-in, and that they're following those employment rules and wage and hour rules when they're scheduled for that time. Okay, so that's a good way to, and not everybody does that. I mean, we have one where the live-in is not on the schedule to provide staffing. She's a backup, and that person can certainly do other things during the day. I think it's how you craft it. It's really personalized. We have a circumstance where we had a live-in who was full-time ComHab, so they basically worked, they provided all the daytime support in addition to their role as a live-in. We have some, the Oscar's case where, you know, they just provide a little bit of time, and then there's other staff that are coming in and out. So you want to just kind of figure out what the best, you know, the way to approach it. In my opinion, what I talk to people about lessons learned is you want to look at, if you're going to have that person also be full-time, will they burn out? You know, they're spending their entire job and their living situation together with your son and daughter. Is that going to lead to potential burnout? You know, so it's really kind of depending upon the live-in, on your son or daughter's needs, and what you're looking for in terms of a program. Okay, so this agreement needs to be reviewed at least annually or more often, and then there has to be a backup plan identified. So in Oscar's case, because there's two live-ins, it affords them the ability to switch off. So they kind of communicate with each other. If somebody is going out and is going to be home after 11, you know, the other person is available, ready and able to support Oscar. If it's one live-in, you know, sometimes families have to step in. So we have a situation where there was a little bit of conflict around this, because the live-in felt like, you know, I like to go, you know, see my family, you know, once or twice a month and spend the weekend. So then the individual had to go home with their parents, which puts a burden on the parents. So, you know, again, it's something important to talk about early on before the person moves in, what the expectation is. The way I like to explain it is, this is supposed to be the live-in caregiver's home, meaning they're living there. So if they, you know, if they're going to be going away 2 weekends a month, and that's not going to work for you, it's probably not the best person to consider. That being said, you do want to be somewhat open to reasonable absences, and figure what you can do in terms of the natural supports that are available to help when the live-in caregiver has to be out. and make sure that you clearly understand together what that should look like. Okay. And then the process to end the agreement has to be clearly defined. This is another area, as I mentioned to you, more recent lessons learned is that it does get a bit of a gray area because the person is living in the apartment, right? So the person might see their situation as a tenant role, or tenancy arrangement. So we want to make sure to be very clear on what the process is. So here, OPWDD is just saying you need to indicate a process to end the agreement. My suggestion is that you put what it looks like if the live-in caregiver needs to leave. So the 60 days is just a suggestion that I made. Some people have 30 days. Because and that's to say to the live-in, you can't just leave us high and dry, right? We need time, ample time to find a replacement if they're leaving on good terms. Let's say that this arrangement is not working out, and maybe your son or daughter is going to come back home to live with you, or live in another situation. You want to give ample notice on the reverse side to the live-in so that they can make arrangements as well. If you can imagine, this person is probably uprooting their situation to live in the home. So you want to give them ample time to be able to find another place to live. That being said, you should always indicate if there's a health or safety issue. So for example, let's say there was an allegation of abuse and something happened. You need to have the ability to remove that person, right? So, what I wrote here, and this was also information that was provided through an attorney that consulted with the New York Alliance on Shared Living, and I'll share that resource with you, but this was the language that was used. So if there's a health or safety issue that would require this agreement to end before the 60 days, that Oscar and his parents reserve the right to determine the appropriate timeframes for the person to leave. And then this last sentence is continued occupancy of the apartment after the termination makes you a licensee holdover, and Oscar and his parents are therefore entitled to charge you for your use and occupancy of the space. So the point of that would be to make it very clear to the live-in that if there's a health or safety issue and that agreement has to end, if we need to ask you to leave right away, then you need to leave, or we will pursue the next steps here. Okay. Any questions? I think you should be able to unmute. If you have any questions, just at any time, just interrupt.
Oh, I was going to write, since this apartment was owned by Oscar's parents, right? You said, you've done this for other people. Do you find it hard to find a place to rent to someone who's going to have this kind of, the money, where the money's coming, you don't understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So in this case, right, the parents did own the apartment. They actually put the apartment in a trust for Oscar. So the trust now owns the apartment. We have others where it's just a traditional rental arrangement. So, a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. We have some in Brooklyn. So finding the apartment is one challenge. Finding the affordable apartment is one challenge. Finding the live-in is the second challenge. However, I think being in New York City in the 5 boroughs, and even in Long Island in some respects, people might be more open to wanting to move here. So we had, an example is one of the arrangements, a guy was from upstate New York and he always wanted to live in the city. So you can't get a better way to live in the city. You don't have to pay rent, and in some cases you even get some income guaranteed if they have the ComHab as a part of it. So I think maybe might be less attractive in other areas, but I think we have a good selling point that we're in the boroughs. But yes, that does take some time, is finding that that right person. So, and I think this goes for staff as well, but when you tack onto the live-in part of it, do you want somebody who's in college? You know that they might leave, or maybe they get married and start a family. So I think in any way you look at it, you might have some transition of people. Do you want somebody who's older, who's maybe retired, somebody who's widowed, and this is a great way for them to have an affordable place to live and they're responsible. So these are just some things that, go through my mind, and for your circle of support to brainstorm about, like who's the best match? Is it somebody who's more of a friend, who's a real typical roommate that your son or daughter will get along with, or is it somebody who's going to be more of a maternal paternal role? So that's very individualized. But yeah, finding an affordable apartment, I think is the number one hurdle to get over. I think the keys to success are just to fully understand the risks and benefits to making an informed decision before proceeding. I think you have to know, when you know your son or daughter, like I mentioned with Oscar, despite the ups and downs of his living arrangement and the different hurdles we've had to approach, I think this is the best circumstance for him. I don't think he personally would flourish in a group home situation where he wouldn't have as much control over his schedule and coming and going. That being said, maybe this wouldn't be the best solution. Having a good involved parents and circle members is key. I know some of you have very involved brokers, so I think having a lot of broker hours would be important. Having involved parents, circle members, because you do need to regularly check in. Like in the beginning, we had to do a lot of meetings with Oscar and his team just to make sure things were going well. Typical household types of things will come up. So I think having somebody who the live-in can speak to, who your son or daughter can speak to. I've been involved in mediating roommate discussions and disputes. So, having somebody that you can call on to say, let's meet every 2 weeks and talk about, or somebody, taking out the trash, do we have like a roach problem because you're not cleaning properly, all these things that come up. Are you having guests over? What's going on? I found, I'm just thinking of things that have happened. I found a bottle of tequila in the freezer, so, these kinds of things that will come up. If you're not in touch regularly, you could lose sight of that, and then the arrangement can deteriorate, right? So you want to just be proactive and meet regularly. And then develop a map of all the steps needed to be addressed. So, finding a place to live, finding the live-in, dealing with all of the moving arrangements, the utilities, working on a very detailed agreement. So, mapping it out, and I would utilize your broker to help with that. Just kind of physically put together, here's our action plan of what we need to do. And set up good communication system and clear roles. So you might want to consider using something like, a Google product to help with communicating, where the staff, maybe there's additional staff that are involved, maybe a place where they write their notes and the live-in caregiver writes notes, and people can just be in the loop as far as things that are going on. And then establishing backup plans and working through, worst case scenarios. So again, we have to anticipate that things will happen, and the best we could do is to try to just think about what those worst case scenarios would be, and like what are some of the proactive approaches we can put into place. Reviewing that live-in caregiver regularly. So again, I mentioned it's due to us once a year, and when a live-in moves in, we have to have that on file. But you might want to adjust that based on new learning. Like I said, that whole licensee statement wasn't in there previously. So we're learning lessons as unfortunate things happen on how to really tighten up that agreement. You want the person to move in, right? So you don't want to scare off the live-in, but you want to make sure that they understand that, the nature of the relationship very clearly from the beginning. And here's a link for and I'll put this on our website as well, the PowerPoint. But here's a link for the New York Alliance. They did a whole learning process on shared living, and they consulted with an attorney. His name was Adam Pecor, and he put together with the New York Alliance a really good toolkit. And in there, it has some information about the way to legally construct that agreement. And that's where I pulled the language from about a licensee. And then understanding the labor laws and regulations. So the easiest way I can describe it is if the live-in caregiver is doing things that another paid staff would be doing, they need to be paid as an hourly employee. So if they're going to be teaching cooking skills, if they're going to be assisting with budgeting, money management skills, then those are things that are in the ComHab plan. You would want to pay that support under ComHab. If they're walking together to go to the supermarket because that's what roommates do who live together, then that's part of a companionship role. And you want to talk about that with the potential live-in so that they understand the differences. Because what we don't want to have happen is somebody move in and say, well, I've been hanging out here for 10 hours. I deserve to be paid for that. So you want to just make sure that they understand the differences. And again, as I mentioned, integrate technology to enhance the ease of communication, so that debit card for food might be a helpful way, or the use of like a Google product to communicate information so that the team is all on the same page. Okay, and then here's Oscar. So this is him and his old teacher who's now very involved in his life. And he has this as a curtain in his living room. So, yeah. So that wraps up my presentation, and definitely want to open it up to you guys if you have any questions, thoughts, comments.
Have you ever done it with two clients and one live-in?
Not directly. I have heard, as part of just talking to other colleagues, there's been a few of those. Actually, I'm sorry, I take it back. My very first experience with a live-in was with two young women who were best friends, and their mothers were best friends. They purchased an apartment in Manhattan, and they proceeded with this model. And then that quickly deteriorated because the mothers could not get along in terms of the hiring of the staff and who was paying more attention to one child over the other. And so one of the moms just pulled her out, and the relationship totally fell apart. So it was not a good outcome. Not to say that it can never be a good outcome, but it is more complicated because now you're adding in another family, an individual into the arrangement, which means that not only are you having to have a written agreement with the live-in, but you should outline very clear agreements with the other individual and their family on responsibilities and decision-making. For example, if somebody decides to move out, who's left to pay the rent there? So there's just even some basic financial issues that have to be ironed out. Okay. Joe?
Yeah, more to that point. So it seems like you could have two individuals sharing an apartment and have their own separate living caregivers. Obviously, you'd have to have 4 rooms, but I mean, again, you add complexity, but.
Yeah, I guess that could be, we'd have to see what the lease would look like in that circumstance. But Yeah, I mean, from the budgetary issue, I'd have to look at, but yes, that very well could be the case. Any other thoughts or comments? There is another, I know I spent this time talking about live-in caregiver, but there's another option for people who are maybe not as comfortable with the idea of somebody living in the apartment. There's in IDGS, there's the paid neighbor option. And the way paid neighbor works is similar to the live-in. The person they require that the person lives within 30 minutes away. So let's take a very simple model. So let's say that your son or daughter is living in an apartment building, and a person who lives upstairs on the floor upstairs could be paid a stipend on a monthly basis to be a paid neighbor. And you would construct an agreement that would outline what they would be responsible for. So if they lived upstairs, your son or daughter lived downstairs, if there's an emergency, they would have to be able to get down there and help out your son or daughter. So instead of being in the apartment, they'd be there. So maybe you'd want to have some sort of technology available, or text or phone or something, a safety alert kind of situation to call them to duty in the overnight hours. And as far as like the fellowship kind of thing is you would maybe put in the agreement, and some people have it, where they're going to touch base every day with a phone call. So it could be like a 5-minute phone call every day. How are things going? Is there anything you need? Everything's going okay. Kind of a touch in, because again, you're paying them as a paid neighbor to be there in the event of an emergency. But some people put that in, that they want that connection more regularly, so that the paid neighbor is fully aware of how to support your son or daughter. And you can also pay that paid neighbor also as an hourly employee in the same way that you would as a live-in. So maybe you're paying them the stipend for them to be available in the overnight hours, but also maybe they provide ComHab services a few hours, a few times a week. So you could mix and match that. So that's an option for folks who, they can live independently, but that's been what I've seen. Like some of the parents are concerned about, like, my child's pretty good, but I'm like really worried that they're going to be on their own. There's going to be an emergency, and who's going to help? Who's going to be there to help them? So this could be a nice option to consider.
And why did Oscar choose to do? Because obviously you could use one model where you have 2 individuals and 1 live-in, or you could use 1 individual and 1 live-in, right? And so why did Oscar choose 2 live-ins?
Well, that actually was because the apartment that they owned is a 3-bedroom apartment. So to cover the cost of the 3-bedroom apartment, it actually worked out to have the live-in caregiver subsidy for the 2 live-ins, and then the housing subsidy for Oscar. So if it was just him and 1 live-in, the family wouldn't be able to cover their basic expenses.
Well, but how do you get? I mean, how do you get a subsidy for 2 live-ins?
You put that in the budget. So basically, the budget allows you to enter the number 2 for live-ins. And then in the housing subsidy tab in the Excel template, in the housing subsidy tab, you put how many people are living there. So you would put Oscar would be 1, and then live-in caregiver would be 2. What's the total rent? Let's say it's $1,800. And then the budget template, the Excel file, divides that by 3. And 2/3 of that gets covered by the live-in caregiver subsidy.
I'm just sort of surprised that the state would pay for 2 live-in caregivers. You'd think the state would say, "Oh no."
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
But and is 2 the limit?
I don't know if there's a limit. I can't imagine it would be more than 2.
I couldn't imagine there'd be more than 1.
I know. I mean, it actually, the reason for the 2 was because of the apartment that was available to them, right? But I think it worked out because I think, some of the feedback I've heard from the live-ins is that, this is like, oh, yeah, they're all in, that they're fully responsible, right? So at least having two people, you have the ability for them to take a break, and have some time that they don't have to feel pressure to be there if they're going to come back at midnight or whatever. The live-ins that we are involved with, they tend to be younger, and so that's another thing is, people like to go out on dates or stay out late, so this is kind of conversations we end up having to have is, this is the expectation that we have. Are you able to meet this?
Well, I'm not saying I think it's fabulous. I'm just, obviously you've got two live-ins and they can spell each other and provide, and so forth and everything. If one live-in is the danger of burnout, that they're always there and they always have to do and so forth, and they they can't be out tonight ever, right? Live-in, because they've got to be on call.
Right.
And I'm thinking in terms of Kellett, who needs constant when her Comhab staff would leave during the day, then in reality she's dependent on the live. But if you have two live-ins, life is easy. Or life is easy.
Yeah. I mean, you could construct it too, like if you're thinking about Kellett and you're thinking maybe, so she's got, let's say, a portion of her day is, day hab, and then she has Comhab, and then maybe you think about, if you're thinking about future plans, you might think about a home attendant or CDPAP, right? That would also supplement, so that maybe you try to construct a schedule that gets you as close to from wake up time to sleep time with the paid support. And then maybe the live-ins provide some of that, but that might help to reduce burnout too, if you can, as much as is approved and to kind of cover all bases.
Linda,
Joe?
just out of curiosity, have there been any special flare-ups or decisions with COVID?
Yeah, actually, we had a family member take the individual home during COVID. So yeah, we had one situation that fell apart due to COVID because the parents, the live-in caregivers, these young guys, and they wanted to, the parents just felt like they weren't being safe, that they were still going in and out, potentially increasing the risk level. So the parents made the choice to bring their son home, and so then the whole arrangement fell apart. But on the flip side, like in Oscar's case, that they kind of quarantined together, like most roommates did, and then came up with an understanding of, we take an oath of responsibility to make sure we're all following the precautions as necessary, because we're living together. We want to take care of each other. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. I've seen both. Is that what you were talking about?
Yes. No. It sounds like there's a new. There may be another section into the agreement now that we have new life experience.
Yes, that is true. Yes.
I have a question. Is it possible, we're thinking about a couple of things down the road, nothing is right now because quarantine has changed. Like we even cannot find the right person for Paul with all of this quarantine, because as soon as we think that somebody is right, we look on the Facebook and this person is party, even now, all the way. So like, no. We're thinking about a couple of options. We just start to taste the water. One of the options is, my daughter is thinking to buy some place in upstate New York or something, and thinking that it will be space for Paul and for somebody who will be, like living person. So if it will be this way, is it possible that she will buy a home, it will be under her title, and Paul Trust is, I don't know how he have to be involved in this or how to make it work, in terms of, because she is like, okay, she is his sister, but, she has her family, everything. She will buy with her husband this house. If I don't think that, I think it's too much responsibility for her, but I mean, if we didn't find anything else, it will be part of the plan. So
Yeah, so that is so
what
basically
should be
the
the right
budget,
approach?
yeah, the budget can pay rent as long as there is a lease agreement. So if your daughter if your daughter buys a place, she would construct a lease agreement with Paul, and she would put, the basic lease terms, and that this is the amount of money that's to be paid and this is who's to pay it, right? So let's just say she buys a 2-bedroom, co-op
Yeah,
or something.
yeah,
Then yeah, she could have a live-in caregiver, and then the fiscal intermediary would pay that portion of the rent that is applied to that live-in share to her as the landlord. So she would basically become like a landlord.
yeah. But in this case, question is,
Mhm.
if it's apartment, yes, but if it will be one family house with a separate room, a separate this, so, and
Oh,
also right away question, she is staying standby guardian to be for guardian if God forbid me and my husband are not there anymore. So,
okay. So Nellie, would she be living in the home? Is that?
well, that's why I'm asking
Yeah.
different kind of. I
Yeah,
want to know what will work.
the living in the home is a little bit more, I think it's possible actually. Let me look into it. I believe
Because
that it is okay.
legally,
Yeah.
legally, she is only my daughter. She is only my daughter. She is
Yes,
not.
she's the
Yeah, and
sister, right?
yeah.
She cannot be, okay, so Nellie, she cannot be paid as a live-in. She can,
I'm not planning
right.
this. I
No,
want to make
I'm
sure
just
that.
walking through it. Yeah, she
Yeah.
cannot be paid as a live-in, but if she's living in the home and, and Paul lives with her, she can be the landlord, but we put that she's
Yeah.
living there
The
too.
idea was to give him like somebody with who he will live because she is doctor. She
Yeah,
cannot do with him anyway. It's not. But the
yeah,
point is, if she will make it like 2 rooms, one is for Paul and next door for this live-in caregiver,
yeah. Yeah,
like kind of
that's
Nana
possible. Like
or whoever.
maybe a two-family home
Yeah.
would be better for that. A two-family home would be better for something like that, where she would have her residence and then Paul
Mm-hmm.
and the live-in would have their residence. So it'd be like a legal two-family home.
Mm-hmm.
But I do
Mm-hmm.
think just as a further point, if you're thinking about long-term,
Mm-hmm.
my understanding is that you can, and I will clarify this, that you can have a live-in. So let's just say you're thinking about
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen to me.
Yeah.
So if something happens to you and you're still living in the home, but maybe you need some help yourself and you can't provide
Mm-hmm.
that level of support, I believe you can also have a live-in. It doesn't have to be that your son or daughter is in their own apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit more complicated, but it is an option.
I honestly doesn't want it. I'm looking for start to feel it, residential and this, but who knows what will be now.
Yeah.
So I'm looking like kind of,
Yeah, no, that's
whatever
good.
it
Yeah,
is.
you want to look at all the different options. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
sure.
you.
And what can you obligate the live-in to do? It strikes me that they don't provide the training of ADLs and all this other stuff, but can you require them to put your child on a day-hab bus and take
Yeah,
off the?
I think so.
Is
In
it,
that,
does the OPPD have
Fall.
a section of rules where, what you can and cannot require a live-in to do?
I was gonna ask that.
so yeah, so I think, William, I think your best bet in that case would be to pay the live-in for waking. So this is how I'm envisioning it. Wake Colette up, get her ready, and put her on the bus. I would pay her as either ComHab staff or CDPAP, because to me, those are specific tasks that another staff would be completing. Now, if when Colette comes home from program, she's watching TV and the live-in's reading a book and they're just chit-chatting, that's companionship, right? that's not providing a direct support. So maybe that's the way you think about it. Providing a direct support needs to be paid in that way, but traditional companionship type relationship, or just being available if there's an emergency, those are part of that live-in caregiver arrangement. That's not that's being covered as under the free room and board.
And putting Kellett to bed would be a direct support.
I think so. It really depends, right? So if it's just saying, "Hey, Colette, it's I'm going to bed. You going to bed. All right, see you in the morning." I think that's
right.
Right. That's different. But if it's did you take a bath? Let me make sure your teeth are brushed good. If it's more involved than just a reminder, I would, on the safe side, make that part of the hourly work that would be provided and paid for. Yeah, and I think somebody in the chat, I know Jen, you answered. So yeah, paid neighbor cannot be a family member. Yeah, unfortunately.
So you know what, Linda, I think I had some questions on this area. It's not my area of expertise here. So for the live-in caregiver, the arrangement can change at any time? You can modify it?
The agreement?
The agreement, yes.
Yeah, you can modify it. Just make sure that, I think that I've seen agreements, and again, I would, I give advice, but I also worried about me giving too much advice because I don't want to be like a party to it. So I think the best thing to do would be to consult with an attorney. I've seen people try to throw in a bunch of different things, like
Right.
For example, can you say to a person, you can't have any alcohol in the home, right? Can you put that in? I guess you could put that in, but these are adults we're talking about. Maybe
Yeah.
in one person's mind, it's not a big deal. Maybe, in another person's mind, yeah, I need to make sure that you can, which is a good point. If the person drinks a whole bottle of wine and then they crash out for the night, they're not going to be able to respond if there's an emergency. So
Right.
I think, it's, you don't want to load it up with too much that it's going to totally turn the person off. To me, the bigger things to address are, when things don't work out, and then to be very clear that they understand the nature of the relationship and what they're getting in exchange for the free room and board, what the expectations are.
And to William's point, is there anything on OPW that says this is what you can or can't ask for?
No, they have and I'll share the link too. They have just a basic agreement template that says, for example, you need to go over the terms of the agreement, need to include, how to end it, or, to define that they're not being paid as an hourly employee. So it's very basic. I think adding in those specifics is left up to the circle to do.
And this doesn't have to change or should be looked at kind of like the paid neighbor agreement at least yearly?
Yes, every year. Yep. It has to be updated every year and reviewed and signed and sent to us. Mm-hmm.
And let's say you have someone who is not working out for whatever reason. How difficult is it to get rid of your live-in?
That's yeah. I mean, we're in a situation.
Yeah.
This is the risk. This is the risk involved. So it could be fine. Like I said, we had this situation where the parent took the individual home, and so then they moved on. The live-in moved on. We have another situation where it's not working out. The personalities are not jiving, and the live-in has been asked to leave, and now that live-in is saying, oh, well, I'm a tenant, you need to give me 90 days or evict me. So that's where, great things can sometimes turn really bad. And then the parent is asking me, well, wait a minute, you said this was a good thing. What do I do? I don't have money to pay for an attorney to evict this person. So I'm saying it to you guys as this is a risk involved. Now, the benefit sometimes outweighs the risk, right? And I think lessons learned is that we have to put in very clearly that, no, you are not a tenant. But again, that person can still say, yes, it says in the agreement that I'm not a tenant, but I get my mail here. So go ahead, take me to housing court anyway. So it's unfortunate that things can, this is not like super tightly sealed up. There's still room for things to not go well, because you're talking about somebody who's living in the home, which if they're living there, they can certainly, anybody can say, I'm going to go to court, and then you have to go through that process for the judge to say, oh no, you're right, you are not a tenant.
But I would suppose it's not any, well, it's the same sort of risks that you take when you hire a support worker who's going to spend, I mean, like Renee spends hours a day with Kellet. And if Renee was not working out, it's not a snap to say, Renee, you're out of here. You've got to demonstrate, you've got to put together why this isn't working, a justification, just like under any employment. So
Yeah.
it's sort of the same risks, only somewhat magnified.
Yeah, I mean, New York is an at-will state, so if it's not working out with Renee, I think you can say it's not working out and terminate her employment. Now, can Renee go into the Department of Labor and say, I'm going to file a claim? Sure. Same thing goes for here. So if you say it's not working out as a live-in, we want you to move out because of health and safety reasons, we want you to move out in a few days, the person can say, oh, I'm a tenant, I'm taking you to housing court and evict me. So whether it's right or legal, like, people still can go through the legal process, and that creates a lot of stress.
You will win. In the state of New York, you will win. No matter what kind of employer, you can be a gold employer and you will be a loser.
Yeah, it's always airing. And the same thing goes for tenancy rights. Tenants are usually
and the
have more rights.
right, and the employment right, and with the unemployment, no matter what these people are doing now, they're getting unemployment. So no matter what, in state of New York, you will lose.
Yeah. So there's definitely risk. But like I said, I think, in my opinion, if you determine that group home living, after you've done your due diligence and have investigated your options, and if you feel like the group living is not the right kind of arrangement, this is something to seriously consider, because it does give you some flexibility and control. All right, so it's a little after 1. So go ahead.
And I assume that I can go on to OPWDD and read up on CDPAP.
CDPAP is Department of Health. It's controlled through, in New York City, it's controlled through the Human Resource Administration, through HRA. So it's separate from OPWDD. That's a personal care service, a consumer-directed personal care service. And to access CDPAP, you'd have to complete, you could talk to the care manager too, to complete a form called an M11Q, where the doctor will indicate that Colette has home care, needs for home care or personal care level of service.
So you can use CDPAP with self-direction.
Yeah.
There's different.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
A lot of people do.
Oh boy.
Yeah. It's another pot. So it's not within the budget, which is good. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. And like I said, I'll share this as soon as I can put it up. I will, and send you guys the PowerPoint. And if you have any questions or want to talk to me about, your unique circumstance, let me know.
So I'm sorry. So two quick things. I just wanted to really thank all of you for such a beautiful video and the emails I've gotten with, my upcoming maternity time. I really appreciate and sincerely love all of you. And Linda, thank you for putting that together. And then also approve all your time cards.
Yeah, Linda, Jennifer, when you are leaving for paternity leave?
Oh, I'm just
when
waiting.
You are leaving, Jennifer?
I'm just waiting. I'm due the 30th. Just patiently waiting.
Okay, because I plan to send all my stuff by Sunday.
Okay, I'll tell him to wait. I'll tell him to wait. Send me your stuff by Sunday.
Okay. I know that Linda and Faye will not leave me, but